Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Murray Hunt, and I'm the Director of the Policy and Evidence Centre on Modern Slavery and Human Rights. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon. The Policy and Evidence Centre, I hope many of you are now familiar with it, is funded by UK Research and Innovation, and it's been brought into being to help bridge the gap between modern slavery research on the one hand and law, policy and practice on modern slavery on the other. And I'm very pleased to be able to say that the Policy and Evidence Centre is now fully up and running. It's taking us a while to get ourselves up and running, but we completed our consultation on our research priorities last year. We've recently published our strategy for the next 3 years, including our indicative research priorities. Those research priorities include identifying and understanding the most effective regulatory and non-regulatory interventions to address modern slavery in global supply chains, and the role of data and data sharing in effective prevention. So one of our first projects has been to get the ball rolling on looking at the role of investors in incentivizing more effective action by businesses to tackle modern slavery in their supply chains, with a particular focus on data, making the most, of course, of the fact that the Turing Institute is one of the consortium partners. So the purpose of today's event is to launch the report of this initial project, Data for Investor Action on Modern Slavery, which is the result of a collaboration between the Turing Institute and the Bingham Centre at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law, with input from Principles for Responsible Investment. In a moment, I'm going to invite the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, Dame Sarah Thornton, to make some introductory remarks before asking the leader of the team of researchers on this project, Dr. Florian Ostman, to present the main findings of the report. Before I do that, just a quick bit of housekeeping first. I will make sure that there's time for question and answers after the panel discussion. We've got some very interesting panelists to discuss the findings of the report. So please can I ask you to put your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat. And please feel free to put those in as the event goes on. We will then, I hope, have plenty of time for your questions to be put to the panelists at the end of the event. So I'd now like to turn to introduce Dame Sarah Thornton. Sarah will need no introduction really to most of you on this call. She is the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, responsible for encouraging good practice in the prevention and detection of modern slavery and the identification of victims. As Commissioner, Sarah has done a lot of work on the role of business in countering modern slavery and recently published an interesting report setting out an agenda for action across the financial services sector. Sarah has also invested a great deal of time and energy in supporting the Policy and Evidence Centre as a member of its advisory group, for which we are extremely grateful. So I'd now like to hand over, please, to Dame Sarah Thornton for her introductory remarks. Sarah.
Thank you very much indeed, Murray, and good afternoon, everybody. I think I've been asked to speak first to explain why this work is really important. And I'm very happy to do that because I do think this is a really, really important area. As Murray says, we have done some work on it. We all know that investors are in a brilliant position to influence business, to make sure that business is really focused on the modern slavery and human trafficking risks in their supply chains. I was listening to a survivor leader yesterday who was talking about being in a forced labour situation and now campaigns about the rebalance between global business and workers. And I thought that idea of rebalancing was really good in the way he explained it. And of course, investors are in a great position to influence business to rebalance. Some of you will be familiar with the Liechtenstein Initiative, sometimes known as Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking, where they talk about finance being the lever on which that entire global economy can be moved. And I think that's absolutely right. And the blueprint that follows from that FAST initiative talks very much about using that leverage to creatively to mitigate modern slavery and human trafficking risks. Also, some of you will be familiar with the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, which, I think there are about 3,000 signatories now, but they really make the point that responsible investment is absolutely key to creating long-term value in business. So it seems to me that investors have a key role, I think, and in particular, to help businesses see modern slavery and human trafficking risks as financial risks to their business. So that's the first thing about why investors are really important. As Murray said, we published a report, I think it was in January this year, which was an agenda for action across the financial services sector, And we've done some survey work as part of that, and we're very disappointed really to see the low levels of awareness in the financial sector. And so one of the things that I did after we'd published the report is I sent it to 51 CEOs of financial institutions, and I'm glad to say 42 responded. And it was very interesting to read their responses, which we will publish an analysis of in the next few months. But quite a few talked about developing toolkits and frameworks and talked about data. So it seemed to me that from the businesses themselves, this is a key area that they need to make progress on. So, I would argue that there is an appetite from investors for more and for better data. And if you look at the sort of attempts that have been to try and develop data, two sorts of approaches at the moment. There's the sort of predictive models, which look at what are the higher risk sectors, what are the higher risk locations, and use that to kind of develop a kind of a risk model. The problem is that that's not very granular and it's not always very accurate. And interestingly, I was talking to some of the supermarkets last week who were talking about the import ban on palm oil from Malaysia and saying it's quite a blunt instrument because there are some businesses in Malaysia who have really taken the forced labour risk seriously. But of course, the analysis, because it's on a sector in a particular country, is not sufficiently nuanced to identify that. So that's kind of one area that's been developed. The second is, some of you might have seen the work that the Traffic Analysis Hub has done, working Stop the Traffic with IBM, with lots of other colleagues, mapping information from NGO reports from the media. And that is really good. But of course, you never know what's not there. You don't know what the unknowns are. And another idea, I guess, is you could map law enforcement data on that. But again, that's an incomplete picture. So we're in the early days, I think, of developing proper data frameworks to really put some sort of easy metric on issues of forced labour and social issues. It seems to me, I don't know if this is the case, but at some point, somebody's going to have to take these various ideas and maybe develop a commercial solution. And it's part of my role, I sometimes think about just trying to say to as many people as I can, it's great that we're doing academic work, it's great that individual businesses are doing it, but actually we probably need data experts to really take this and see that in the long run, they can make money from it, and then kind of in that way, make a more mature sort of approach to data, and indeed find that elusive metric. People often say, when you think about ESG, we've now really got good metrics on the environment. But of course, that's taken 20 years. And of course, a lot of mandatory reporting. So I think we will get there. It just is going to take time. And that's why this report is so important. So, it might be that like we have kind of the carbon footprint, might we have in 10 years' time or 5 years' time, a forced labour indicator, which is has lots of brain power behind it, lots of thought and lots of understanding, but actually is really simple to understand. So last point, really welcome this work. It sets the scene, and particularly like that work looking at ideally what we would like in terms of data and what are the gaps. So I think it's a great basis for discussion, and I hope it really incentivizes further development of useful models to ensure that investors can really play their part in making sure that businesses take modern slavery and human trafficking risks seriously. Thank you, and I'll hand back to you, Murray.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. It's really great for us to have your endorsement of the importance of this work. I think you're absolutely right. We're in the early days of recognising both the importance of the role of investors as a potential lever, but also how relatively young the metrics are and the data is. So we're on the beginning of, I hope, quite an exciting journey here. So thank you very much indeed, Sarah, for framing the event in that way. I'd now like to move, please, to introduce Dr. Florian Ostman, who led the research team. Florian is the policy theme lead within the public policy programme at the Alan Turing Institute, and his research centres around applications of data science and AI in the public sector generally, and he's previously worked as a consultant on responsible investing, including for modern slavery risk. Florian, can I hand over to you, please, to present the findings of the report?
Thank you very much, Murray. And I hope everyone can see my screen. So I'm going to take the next 15 minutes or so to provide a brief overview of our report's main findings. Before starting, however, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge my colleagues who've worked with me on this project. As already mentioned, this has been a collaborative effort between the Alan Turing Institute and the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law. And I'm very grateful to Alex Harris at the Alan Turing Institute and Nyasha Weinberg, Irene Pietro Paoli, and Lee Smith at the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law. It's been a real pleasure to be able to work on this project together. When we set out to pursue this project, our aim was to map out the role that data can play in enabling investors to take more effective action on modern slavery. And the motivation for this project was the fact that when we started, it seemed very difficult to obtain a bird's eye view on the solutions landscape as it currently exists. So it seemed very difficult to get a comprehensive overview on what are the kinds of data resources that are currently available and where are gaps in the landscape that need to be filled. And so that's the situation we're trying to address with this report. We're essentially conducting a gap analysis that considers, on the one hand, what data, what insights and tools would be available in an ideal world. And on the other hand, where are we currently? What resources exist today? And we pursue this through 4 analytical steps. And these steps are reflected in the structure of the report, which essentially consists of the following 4 parts. The first part considers investors' information needs. So in other words, we consider the kinds of questions that investors need answers to if they want to address modern slavery risks. Secondly, we consider the relevant types of data that may be useful in providing answers to those questions. Third, we consider ways of analyzing data in order to arrive at actionable insights, the kinds of insights that investors need. And then fourth, we think about ways of presenting those insights to investment decision makers in ways that are useful, scalable, and easy to integrate into investment decision-making processes. So I'll now briefly go through each of these parts and provide a short summary of our main findings in each part. When it comes to investors' information needs, we draw a broad distinction between 2 areas. On the one hand, there's the area of understanding the significance of the issue of modern slavery in the context of a given company. On the other hand, there's the area of understanding how a company performs in addressing the issue, in other words, in managing modern slavery risks. And in each of those areas, we break things down further by distinguishing between 2 subtasks in each case. So in the case of significance, we distinguish between the task of assessing salience, which is the task of understanding the severity and likelihood of modern slavery-related impacts on people. And secondly, the task of assessing financial materiality, in other words, understanding the likelihood and severity of impacts on a company's financial performance. Moving on to company performance, we distinguish between the task of defining performance goals, which can involve considering legal requirements that apply to a given company, but also best practices that go above and beyond legal requirements. And then the task of measuring performance, in other words, understanding to what extent a company meets those performance goals. And that can take an absolute form or a comparative form by comparing a company's performance to its peers in a given industry, for example. So those are the information needs. We then move on to considering what are the types of data that could be relevant or useful in finding answers to those questions. I should start by saying that in doing so, we adopt a very broad perspective. As many of you will be aware, there are certain types of data that are very prominent to investors and are currently already widely used. So for example, non-financial disclosures that companies make, including modern slavery statements, are a prominent case, or company rating data provided by independent data suppliers. We include those types of data, but we adopt a much broader perspective and really think about the full range of data that exists in relation to modern slavery that may be useful in relation to those questions that I mentioned earlier, regardless of the extent to which they're currently used by investors, or regardless of the fact of how easy it would be to use them. So it's a very, very wide net. And we structure that discussion by considering 4 categories of information. The first 2 categories comprise information that is contextual in nature. So information that doesn't refer to a specific company, but helps to understand the context in which a company operates. The first category here is information, contextual information about the occurrence of modern slavery, which can include records about known cases of modern slavery, for example, from law enforcement, systematic estimates about the prevalence, such as the Global Slavery Index, and other more broader issue-focused publications. The second category is contextual information about societal expectations. So that includes information about relevant laws and regulations, but also about non-legal expectations that may come from a range of different stakeholder groups, including, importantly, from investors themselves. And I'm sure during the panel discussion later on, we'll hear about some of the investor initiatives that have put forward expectations from the investor side. The next 2 categories then consider company-specific information, so information that relates to particular companies rather than being contextual. The third category consists of company-specific information that is controlled by those companies themselves. The most prominent example here would be non-financial disclosures, such as modern slavery statements, but company registry entries, financial statements, and all kinds of non-public data that companies hold can also be relevant and form part of this category. And the fourth category then considers company-specific information from independent sources, the most prominent example being company ratings, but this category also includes data on independent audits, data on controversies, proceedings, and finally what we refer to as observable business activity footprints, which, for example, include data on financial transactions, in the fishing context, vessel tracking data, or customs and logistics data that may be publicly available. So that's a high-level overview of the types of data that we've identified. We then move on to considering how might data be analyzed in order to arrive at the kinds of insights that investors need. We approach this part by distinguishing or by considering, on the one hand, obstacles that currently exist when we look at the existing landscape, and then thinking about opportunities for overcoming some of those obstacles. In terms of obstacles, there are 4 main points that we highlight in the report. The first one is ease of analysis. For many types of data, it is difficult to analyze that data at scale and in technology-driven ways, especially in cases where data is unstructured. So think again of modern slavery statements, for example, where text is embedded in documents in an unstructured form. That makes it very difficult to extract information from those documents. Secondly, there are all kinds of empirical blind spots, and that goes back to some of the comments that Dame Sarah made at the beginning. Different types of data suffer from different forms of blind spots, but it's really a general problem across most categories that no category of data provides a complete empirical picture. Thirdly, there are issues of data comparability, especially where there is a lack of transparency about the methods used for producing data. It can be difficult to compare data from different providers. And finally, there can be all kinds of obstacles, of course, to data access, be it because of confidentiality issues or issues of commercial interests and financial barriers for accessing data. Those are the obstacles we identify. In thinking about opportunities, we specifically focused on the role that data science can play in overcoming some of those obstacles. And I should start by saying that not all of those obstacles can be overcome through data science. So data comparability, data access issues are structural issues that require other kinds of solutions. But when it comes to ease of analysis and empirical blind spots, we identified a number of promising strategies. For example, in the case of ease of analysis, there are promising uses of natural language processing to analyze information contained in documents. And we highlight some ongoing work, for example, the ongoing project pursued by Walk Free and the Future Society to come up with ways to make modern slavery statements machine readable. That's a relevant example in this context. And then when it comes to empirical blind spots, there are a couple of examples of strategies that are promising, including trying to make inferences about missing or weak information rather than just treating those cases as unknowns, overlaying and cross-checking information from different sources, and using advanced forms of modeling for better modern slavery estimates. Again, that's a point that goes back and resonates with Dame Sarah's comments in the introduction, and the fact that currently a lot of those prevalence estimates are very coarse and lack the kind of granularity that we would ideally like to see. So that's our research on analyzing data. And the final part then considers presenting insights to decision makers. So just to make this a bit more vivid, the kind of things that we thought about in this part of the report are, what forms might dashboards or interactive tools take that investment decision makers can use to access information and then integrate it into decisions. And once again, we start by thinking about limitations and then move on to identifying strategies for improvement. When it comes to limitations, we begin by considering limitations at the collective level. When we consider all of the solutions that are currently out there, what are the things that are missing, so to speak? And we can see that there are certain types of data that are currently underutilized across all the existing solutions. So certain types of data that just aren't being used. There are also certain types of insights that are very hard to find across all existing solutions. And finally, a lot of existing solutions suffer from problems of incomplete coverage. So for example, in the case of company ratings, most solutions only cover a small part of the universe of investable companies. And of course, investors ideally would like to see a tool that covers all companies that an investor may have in their portfolio. There are then also limitations at the level of individual solutions. And there are 2 points that we highlight there. First of all, there's what we call the fragmentation of capabilities, which is to say different tools address all kinds of different information needs and use different sources of information, but they all do so sort of in a fragmented way, and different tools do different things, but rarely does a tool do multiple things at once. And that means that if an investor would like to make use of all the information out there, you need to use a large number of tools concurrently, which of course becomes impractical quite easily. There's also a lack of flexibility in many cases, where it is difficult to modify certain methodological assumptions in the way investors might want to modify them. So for example, in the case of company ratings, investors may want to be able to adjust performance expectations based on their own expectations, but existing ratings come with certain performance goals baked in, so to speak. We then consider strategies for improvement, and the way we approached that side of the work was to think about 2 possible future scenarios, which we described as 2 visions. The first vision is the more modest one, maybe the more realistic one, or the more sort of short-term approach, which would involve focusing on the first 3 limitations and trying to fill existing gaps. So try to develop tools that use data that currently isn't being used, that provide insights that currently aren't provided, and also to try to close coverage gaps. The second vision is the more ambitious one, which would include all of the above, but it would also try to integrate capabilities in a single tool. So the utopian vision would be a single tool that provides all the answers that investor needs and draws on all sources of information that are available. Now that's of course, may sound utopian and it's probably difficult to achieve in the foreseeable future, but there's sort of we can move along on that path and try to develop tools that in a single tool combine a greater number of capabilities than is currently the case. So those are the 2 visions, and that's essentially the note that we end on in the report. We also add a number of recommendations at the end, which I'll just briefly mention, because they may also help frame the discussion. The first recommendation is the need to increase awareness for the importance of investor action on modern slavery. So we've already heard, and it's quite clear that investors are increasingly aware of the importance of modern slavery as an issue, but there's a long way to go for that awareness to be universal. And so one recommendation is to increase efforts to spread that awareness in the asset management and investor community. The second recommendation is to incentivize and invest resources into the development of data solutions that are geared specifically towards the needs of investors. If we look at the solutions landscape, we see that solutions can cater to different audiences, and the investor audience tends to be somewhat neglected compared to other audiences. Third, we recommend that any additional or new solution development efforts focus on the kinds of limitations and the kinds of strategies for improvement that we've identified, that I just went through in going through the previous two slides. Fourth, we emphasize the need and the importance of coordination. There's a large number of actors involved and active in the solution landscape. And as mentioned earlier in the opening remarks, those include commercial actors as well as non-commercial actors. And if we are to realize the synergies that we see that could be realized and avoid the duplication of efforts, it's quite clear that we need to increase the degree of coordination and transparency in terms of being transparent about what different efforts entail and what gaps remain. And then finally, our last recommendation is the need to prioritize usability and interoperability in producing data and in designing solutions. Examples here would be, for example, the need for data producers to think about how useful their data is going to be specifically to investors. Think, for example, about companies that produce modern slavery statements. It would be very useful if those companies thought about how useful those statements will be to investors, both in terms of the content that they contain, but also their format. For example, are they machine readable? Do they have a comparable format across companies, and so on and so forth? That's just one example. There are other examples of considerations of usability and interoperability that we discuss in the report, but I'll leave it at that. That concludes my summary. I hope that has given you a rough idea of the content of the report, and also maybe spurred some interest in reading the report for yourself. You'll be able to find the report on the Modern Slavery PAC's website under the link that I've included on this slide. Thank you very much, and back to you, Murray.
Thank you, Florian, very much indeed. Extremely interesting. What I find so interesting about this particular report, and I hope others will share this enthusiasm, is the way in which it combines across disciplines your colleagues at the Turing Institute's expertise in data science with some legal input on business and human rights, on measuring other things, rule of law in other contexts. So I think it's a really distinctive contribution, bringing together that expertise. And that's one of the things that the PEC is very much hoping to do, to facilitate these sorts of interdisciplinary collaborations, which I think will be very beneficial in the modern slavery space. Florian, thank you very much indeed for that presentation of the report's findings. We can now move to our panel discussion. We have three expert panelists to help us to discuss the interesting issues which are raised by the report. Each of them are going to speak for about 10 to 12 minutes to make sure that we've got enough time at the end for questions and answers. And I'm going to introduce them as they speak. So we'll turn first of all to Elena Espinosa. Elena is the acting head of social issues at the Principles for Responsible Investment, PRI, where she manages collaborative engagements and research on social issues. Elena supports investors' efforts to identify and address risks and opportunities around topics such as human rights, labour practices, inequality, diversity, and the social dimension of climate strategies. Elena, welcome. If I can kick off the discussion by asking you, from your vantage point in working very closely with investors, where would you say we are in the journey of raising awareness for the issue of modern slavery in the investment context?
Thank you, Marie, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this event. Very excited about the report coming out, and I think, yeah, data is an issue that we talk about with investors quite a lot, and not just for modern slavery, but for many issues that we work at the PRI. I think in terms of your question, the answer is it depends in terms of the investor and their own investment priorities and whether they understand if modern slavery is an issue or not for the work that they do. Unfortunately, I think is what Florian suggested in his presentation. I mean, there is a lot that we need to do in terms of awareness in the financial industry about modern slavery. I think in part is because investors tend to be quite far apart from where these issues happen, and therefore they have very little visibility of these issues. And so far, and also because of that distance, there is a little bit of a disconnect in terms of the issue and what they can do about it and how much influence they have in solving that issue. I would like to mention a recent report from Walk Free, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and WikiRate, that they look at the financial sector and their compliance with the Modern Slavery Act, with the UK Modern Slavery Act, and the results were quite outstanding in the sense that, I mean, they said that 53% of the investors in the research failed to meet the minimum requirements of the Modern Slavery Act. 54% did not disclose due diligence to address modern slavery risk in their supply chain. And only 27% disclosed conducting some form of due diligence on human rights in the modern slavery in their portfolio. And I can keep going and the numbers don't get better. And I think in part is because investors also put a lot of emphasis on what companies are doing in supply chains, but they don't understand very well the role that they have to play in this particular issue. So I think this report comes in at a great time, and I think it's a moment of awakening for investors. I think also with COVID-19, I mean, as horrible as the pandemic has been, it's also been a wake-up call for investors in terms of how important social issues are, how important it is, the role that they need to play in addressing these issues. And as we think now, as we come out of this pandemic and how we're going to build back better, they need to also rethink the role that they play in getting their companies and their portfolios and investors themselves to look at social issues and act on them. And I think, yeah, I mean, the conversation around human rights, specifically thinking about saliency and the severity of the issues is quite important in the sense that we're asking investors to think about the risk to people and secondly about the risk to business. And this is to understand how their investment activities impact the rights of people, and that's where the focus should be. And this, in many cases, most likely will link up to a business risks and will have a financial materiality to it. But that should come as a second step. And we do this because, yeah, probably as an investee company, and if you look as one investee company, the issue might not be financially material in the sense that obviously we focus on cutting costs, then modern slavery, well, I mean, does help in achieving that. But when we think about it as a systemic issue, it does have great impacts in the economy as a whole that will then eventually have impacts in the company's performance and therefore in the return for investors. So this is why this requires a collective action, and we cannot just look at it from a perspective from a company to company, although the action is to happen from company to company. So I think in the sense, data is a great tool for investors, because I think at the moment these results that we see in this analysis about the compliance with the UK Modern Slavery Act is a little bit that ignorance is bliss, that investors don't know where the issue is, and therefore it's a little bit like it doesn't exist. Whether if we increase the amount of data that they receive and the analysis that they can do, then it will come more to the forefront and they will be able to do something about it. And yes, there are a lot of obstacles in terms of how that data can be acquired and how you can link modern slavery to the different companies in your portfolio. But I mean, as the more investors ask for this information, the better the quality of the information will be as well. So I think it's a little there's a little bit of a role they can play in the sense that they have the power to demand this from companies, and not only demand the data, but demand quality and demand improvement in how this data is collected and then analyzed and used. So, I mean, a lot of work that we have ahead of us, but there is motivation and there is momentum to actually have critical mass when it comes to dealing with modern slavery, and for investors to understand the great role that they have to play in getting companies to think about these issues and eradicate modern slavery, but also provide remedy when needed as well, and to provide access to remedy and then help to the victims to then come back into society and into the economy as well.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. I think it's a really interesting point about how the quality of information tends to improve once the data is actually demanded and is actually provided over the long term. I think it's an interesting point. Could I just ask you to go back to explain a bit? You mentioned the importance of a salience-based approach, focusing on the significance to rights holders as opposed to financial materiality. I know that's a big issue in the discussions. Could you just explain that a bit more for us?
Yes, I'm going to take a little bit from, I mean, we published a report in last October on why investors should work on human rights and how to do it. And in there, we talk about the concept of severity. And it's basically about assessing the scale of the outcome on an individual and the scope and how the irremediable character of the impact as well. So, I mean, so it's looking at those factors and understanding how this issue has an impact on the person. So I mean, it has to come from the perspective of the human being and understanding where these issues are happening and how are impacting the people, but understanding as well, the scope, like how many people are being impacted as well, and how irremediable this impact is. So it's very similar, to be honest, it's very similar to the concept of risk management, but instead of thinking of the company and the impact on the company, thinking on the impact of your stakeholders and the affected communities.
Thanks, Anna. That's really clear. Are there any examples of good practice that you would point to that we can learn from in this context? Are you aware of any lessons that we can learn from other contexts?
Yeah, definitely. I think, I mean, one of the recommendations from the FAST initiatives of finance against trafficking and slavery, one of the main recommendations was actually to lean on existing regulation and lean on existing processes that investors already have in place. And one easy one to think about is anti-money laundering legislation and activities. I mean, this is something that every financial institution would have in place. And usually activities linked to anti-money laundering will have a link to modern slavery as well. So it's actually a process that already exists. It's usually a process that is quite sophisticated within financial sectors, and it's one that they can piggyback on as well to actually understand modern slavery risks and what they can do to solve these issues as well. So usually investors don't make the connection, but it's actually a process that already exists. And these legislations, I mean, because modern slavery acts like in the UK, they are not that widespread, but anti-money laundering legislation will probably exist everywhere in the world. So they will have something to fall back on when they're thinking about legal requirements and regulatory compliance when they're talking to the companies in their portfolio.
And finally, Eleanor, if you had to choose one priority, your number one priority, which would make the most progress in the next short while, what would that be?
Well, I think is the raising of awareness for investors is showing them that this issue happens and it is important and that they do have a role to play and that it impacts their financial performance and the companies in their portfolio. And again, it's trying to make that link between the impact where it happens and the investors at the other end of the chain. So I think definitely that first recommendation I think is key if you want investors to take action on this issue.
Excellent, Eleanor. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure that there'll be plenty of questions for you, so we'll hear more from you later on. I'd like to move now, please, to our second expert panelist, Anita Dorrit. Anita is director of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, which is an initiative of the Interfaith Centre on Corporate Responsibility. Anita mobilizes investor leverage to engage corporations on human rights due diligence based on the UN Guiding Principles for Human Rights and on other international human rights standards and laws across multiple sectors. Anita, if I could ask you first, your work involves advising investors on human rights and modern slavery risks. What would you say are the key issues and challenges that arise in that context? And could you also say a bit about what you see as the role of data in that context?
No, thanks so much for that, Murray, and thanks to everyone for organizing this this event. I'll pick up from a number of points that Elena raised as well. And, when you spoke with the fact that, the Investor Alliance and our work is grounded on the principles set out in the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. So under the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, businesses, including investors, have a duty to respect human rights. What does that really amount to? Investors need to understand that under these regulations and using international frameworks, investors have to take action to address human rights risks, which includes modern slavery risks, in their investment portfolio and as part of their investment activities. It's not a nice to have, it's something that they need to do. And they need to understand that under the UN Guiding Principles, the investors are connected to the human rights risks and harms of the companies that they invest in. So it's not, and Elena talked about the fact that, investors have a great distance from, in fact, the human rights harms, the modern slavery harms that exist. And that's true. But investors need to understand that they have a link, they are directly linked to these harms, and hence they have a duty to carry out to understand what those risks are. And that's where data, in a sense, comes into place. But before I get into this concept of data, under the UN Guiding Principles, they have really set out this framework to manage human rights risks. I mean, companies have enterprise risk management systems, and as part of those ERMs, they need to include really addressing not just financial risks and business risks, but risk to people, human rights risks. And the UN Guiding Principles sets out this framework which is called the human rights due diligence process, which involves 4 steps of being able to assess what human rights risks are impact your business or your business's cause or contribute to or linked to, how you then address that through policies and processes, monitoring the progress, understanding the effectiveness of your efforts, and providing public disclosure on this. And the public disclosure part of it is the data part of it, which is the data that companies provide on the steps that, first on identifying the risk and what steps they've taken to address the risk, and is really key data that investors need to understand a specific company's performance on modern slavery risks in their supply chain. However, that's not the only source of data that investors rely on. And in fact, it's what we recommend to investors, that you can't just look at data that's coming from companies. When you look at human rights risks, you're looking at risks to people. And businesses tend to look at risks to the business. And so a lot of the data that's available today, whether it's provided by companies or through commercial data providers, tend to take into account financial risk and materiality from that perspective. So really what Elena was also referring to is really looking at what we consider to be salient or material human rights risks. And so to look at that, you can't just look at information coming from the company. You need to look at data really from a broader set of data providers or sources of information. And that goes to what Florian spoke to about the breadth and the depth of data. And so that involves investors as well engaging with communities that are impacted by business operations. And how do they do that? It's not easy, again, for investors to speak to these communities. So what we do is we rely on nonprofit organizations that create benchmarking reports relating to modern slavery performances by companies. Know the Chain is one such benchmark report that provides quite a detailed analysis across a number of indicators. Of course, they can do that across only a certain number of companies, and hence the breadth of it is somewhat limited. But in addition to that, to also engage with civil society organizations and human rights experts on these areas to really look at a broader source of information. So in that sense, that's one of the pieces that I would speak to, that really investors need to look at this from the perspective of their own responsibility to respect human rights. And in terms of asking for data, right, again, building on what Elena said, you need to ask for this data. If not, it will never come to you. And that quality of data will also depend on how many investors are asking for this information, what type of information we are requiring. And whilst investors get information from companies directly, another key source of information are really data providers, ESG data providers. And investors need to as well push these data providers to say, the information you provide us really provides just really top line pieces of information that is based on publicly available data from the company. We want you to dig deeper. In order for us to carry out our duty to respect human rights, we need that robust data. And so not only pushing the companies, but pushing data providers, and pushing data providers to go to sources that you're aware of. For example, talking to human rights defenders who are championing these issues. What is really happening on the ground, and to get some, ground truthing on the issues. Another point that I wanted to raise about modern slavery risk is the opacity, I guess, of supply chains. So what has come up, which is also quite surprising in a lot of conversations, is when we speak to companies and we try to understand, so what are your modern slavery risks? A lot of them say, so we've done an audit and, we don't find any risks in our supply chain. And, all that means is that they haven't really done a good analysis, or they don't understand their supply chains. And in a particular situation that has come up recently, where we're engaging on a particular incidence of forced labor, we've been really pushing companies who've been named in these reports to ask these questions. What have you done? And a lot of the responses is, well, we don't really understand our full supply chain. And that is really, really surprising for us. How are we investing in companies that don't understand their full supply chain? And so that need for transparency is key. Supply chain is one. And the other thing I just want to raise is, looking at value chains, right? So where you look at upwards, who are your customers? So in the context of modern slavery, where you're talking about sex trafficking or human trafficking, the responsibility of transportation, logistic companies, airlines, hotels, and what actions they're taking, and what kind of data that they can provide on this as well. Not just looking at supply chains, but really looking upwards. What are the products and services that you use that enable modern slavery? Companies who produce surveillance technology, for example, who are they selling it to, and how is this being used in that modern slavery context? So those are some of the ideas or concepts that I think we found challenging when we've tried to address this issue.
Anita, thanks very much. Can I just ask, how does the data that's available for modern slavery risk compare with the data that's available for other types of human rights risk?
To be honest, I would say that modern slavery risks or work, really issues relating around workers' rights and labor are where there is a lot of data available. Or let me rephrase it, there is more data available in this area than I find in other areas of human rights. For example, the right to privacy or the right to free expression. And so on balance, when it comes to modern slavery, there is a fair amount of sources of information, a fair amount of organizations that are already focusing on it. So I would say that this is an area sort of ripe for the taking. The data, there is a fair amount of data focused analysis being done. It's now how that is then translated to cover up gaps, to really fill up those blind spots. And also, as Florian says, to kind of analyze it in a way that allows you to look at it comparatively across a big data piece across the whole industry, or within certain vertical sectors as well.
Thanks very much, Anita. I mean, it sounds as if you think there's not a very integrated approach by businesses across their ESG responsibilities.
No, and if I can speak to that. I mean, yes, and that's a great point. I mean, ESG risks, and investors are. I mean, the change in the marketplace is no longer talking about shareholder primacy, but really stakeholder primacy. And that's been a change that has been sort of adopted and spoken to by, CEOs of companies through business roundtables, et cetera. So we really moved to that place. And with that, ESG risks and the demands by the financial community to want companies to address not just financial risk, but risk to these other stakeholders, hence ESG risks has become a big push. So capital markets, financial markets are pushing for this. But what you see is people taking a very siloed approach to these issues. And so what you do see is in the climate sector, which we know has been developing over the last 20 years, and there is a lot more data there, that companies that focus on environmental issues don't incorporate into them what are human rights risks or modern slavery risks. So you do see in renewable energy sectors sort of forced labor risks that immense sort of workers' concerns, rights to workers that existed in the fossil fuel age, just kind of cutting over and carrying on in the renewable sector. So this idea of not having a just transition across the piece, right? Looking at really ESG risks or risk to stakeholders and not just the business sort of broadly and interconnectedly.
And how important is data to breaking down the silos?
It's key. It's the only thing then that, at the end of the day, looking at data in terms of its breadth, its depth, its granularity is all what we need in order to make our decisions. Without data, without that information, we can't move forward. The need is then to look at things more broadly, to look at things more holistically. And I think that is really some of the recommendations that are made in this report that we wholly support as well.
Great, Anita, thank you very much indeed. I'd now like to move to our final expert, Dr. Tony Lanier. Tony is Sustainability Director at the Worldwide Generation. She's worked for over 28 years in the fields of sustainable finance and sustainable development in the finance sector. She was the first managing director of the Dow Jones Sustainability Group Index. She worked at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and she's advised companies about external reporting on sustainability issues. Tony, welcome. Can I ask you, from your substantial experience in your work around sustainability data, what is your take on the role of data and the challenges around the use of it and access to it in enabling investors to take effective action?
Well, there's two things I would like to address, and Maria, I'll get to both of them, and maybe there's a cover from both of them on that really good question. The two issues I want to talk about is one about the investors, and I'd hope that Elena or Anita would have actually pointed this out, but investors are not a homogeneous group, right? There are asset owners, there's asset managers, there's private equity, there's venture capital, there's a whole host of types of investors that actually look at different types of things and takes on different types of risks. And I think that that's important actually to recognize that because they're not all the same, that good data has a role to play in all of them. So I just wanted to bring that up because as an ex-investment banker, a recovering investment banker, investors are just not one single group. And in fact, because they're not homogeneous, what I like to do is I like to go back to the basics and look at the actual models for investors. So the capital asset pricing model or the equity risk premium, et cetera, because investing is not about picking the winners, it's about avoiding the losers. And if you can avoid the losers by having better, more timely, consistent, and transparent data, then you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. I think data flows into this quite easily, but I think one of the biggest challenges and what we're working on at Worldwide Generation is actually the quality of the data, because ESG data, if anyone was to say that ESG data is fresh and new and transparent, it wouldn't be the case. In fact, some ESG data can be up to a year old, and that's all types of ESG data. I mean, what we're trying to do, or at least what I think there's a concerted effort, is actually to using new technology in order to make data much more timely, much more consistent, have a lot more transparency for all the investors. Because right now, this data is actually collected in a very ad hoc way, different types of quality, different types of units, et cetera, which makes it really difficult to actually standardize and to compare and contrast. Investors like to put things in their portfolios and actually understand how one company might be doing better than the other, or that their bond might be doing better than the other. But and then there's also a bigger challenge when it comes to the data, that it is actually disseminated quite lumpily. So if you are an investor that's interested in a specific topic like modern slavery, depends on who you talk to, depends on which conference you go to, you might get other bits of data, which is very challenging actually when you're trying to make well-informed investment decisions. So I think that there's a concerted effort actually when it comes to legislation, to the corporate sustainability reporting directive, to the sustainable finance reporting directive. The SEC has taken it on actually in the last couple of days. You have FRAG. You have a bunch of organizations that are looking at legislation in order to actually standardize the information. So once the information comes on, the investors or businesses can be very confident that the data they're getting is correct, not filled with errors, and not gamified as well. I mean, that's something that happens as well. So if we get data that is consistent, transparent, and is timely, you can use some new investment, some new innovation and technology, whether it be blockchain or distributed ledger technology, where you can go down to the granular bit of data. You can collect the data pieces and put everything around it, wrap that data in everything that it needs in order to give you a degree of comfort that data is then correct. It is the version of the truth for that data. And I think that Anita hit on it, and Elena both hit on it, is that these data points, they need to be correct. They need to be without error in order to be used very effectively. So that's one way that you can use innovative technology to put it down the blockchain. Becomes an immutable piece of data, and you can be very confident that it's correct. I think Florian also addressed it in his report about how one of the bigger hurdles is actually looking at the errors in the data. But once you're confident in the data, once you have all this data available with all of the accoutrements around it to give you a degree of comfort, then you can use it much more effectively. So businesses can make well-informed business decisions, whether it's strategy, whether it's allocation of resources, and those resources might be intellectual resources, human capital, financial. They can also make decisions about where they should go in the world in order for manufacturing, et cetera. But also investors can use it to make well-informed investment decisions, whether it be on debt, whether it be on equity, because they can put it into their models and they can be confident their models will spit out what they need to in order to make well-informed decisions. And lastly, those that put together models. So those part of the financial community, whether they're indices or rating agencies, everyone knows the better the data, the better the quality of data that goes into their models, the better the models are. So that's not something that we addressed. We talked about data and the importance of data. And what I always like to go back to is, let's go back to the basics and actually make some fundamental questions. Is the data good enough for us to then go to the next step, which is, can we use this data effectively? Once again, on the investment side of things, is the investor getting enough information? And I think Anita said that how important that is to make sure that they get enough information, but can they be confident that that information is A, not gamified, B, not made up, and has all that it needs for those that are making investments to make those decisions which actually create this transformational change that everybody's looking for when it comes to modern slavery. I just want to end on one point. I don't know the answer to this, but it has always intrigued me. In late last century, I was working with Nike, and Nike had one of the bigger issues when it came to child labor and enforced labor. Nike wanted to be a good corporate responsible organization, so they decided not to have any child labor. Well, the consequences of that is that the amount of child sex workers went up, because these children were not just child laborers. They were actually contributing to the family income. So Nike had to kind of rethink of how they looked at it. They couldn't just not employ these children. They had to figure out a new kind of solution. And I think that we're really at the cusp right now is trying to find new solutions. We're trying to find a solution that actually solves more than one thing. So what did Nike do? They decided to say, we're going to employ children at a good rate, but they only have to work half the day. And the other half the day, they would go to school, and that school would be on the campus. So they didn't have to go 10 kilometers to go to school. They would go on the campus. And at this rate, and that was last century. And now I just found out a couple of years ago that some of those same children that were schooled within the Nike Academy or the Nike school on the campus are now middle managers within these Nike organizations. So not only did Nike find out, okay, we'll reduce the number of child sex workers, and these children were still gave a contribution to their family, but they were educated at the same time. So I think data has a really good role to play, but it should look at more than one siloed aspect. It should actually give you enough information that you can solve more than one challenge at one time. And I think investors are starting to think the same way, is if they can make an informed investment decision, whether it's through a project of financing or debt financing or equity financing, what is the primary and secondary and tertiary impacts of that investment, then suddenly the return on the investment goes up exponentially.
Thanks very much. Tony, could I just ask you to say a little bit about your experience in setting up the Dow Jones Sustainability Index?
Yeah, that was last century too, Murray. So gotta think way back. Yeah, it was an interesting time. It's one of those things you think, where was I at that time in my life? But it was when I was first managing director, when you'd get on the phone and you'd talk to people about sustainability and the environmental impacts of what they're doing, their activities, et cetera, no one was interested in the first year. But then it picked up steam. And I think it picked up steam because we did a league table, to be honest with you. And suddenly we had CEOs that were calling us, and suddenly companies were very interested in giving us the information about how well they're doing on their social areas and their governance as well as environmental. So it was a kind of a crazy time. I think what happened at Dow Jones had a certain place in time, but I'm now quite cognizant of the fact that when it comes to gathering of that data, how we did it at Dow Jones needs to change. There needs to be a sea change. It can no longer be this kind of amorphous, great, huge questionnaire that's hugely painful for a lot of companies. It has to be dynamic. It has to be nimble. It has to allow the companies actually to say what they're doing in a timely manner. That's not a year old and sometimes 18 months old. So Dow Jones had its time, and I think it probably still will continue to have its time for a little while. But I think the world is changing to demanding and understanding better forms of more transparent and competent data.
So would you say there are any sort of immediate lessons from that experience for the modern slavery context?
I think there is. I think what happened with modern slavery is that it became something that people talked about and understood that it could be a risk to the company. Back then, it could be a risk. There was we did lots of back testing. We did a lot of back casting to try to figure out whether or not there was a demonstrable difference in returns of investment. Now, 23 years later, we now have a lot of history to say whether or not that becomes an issue. And I think that modern slavery actually does have an impact on the value of equity specifically. And we just have to look back, and was it early last year? Somebody correct me, when, what was it, Primark or there was another clothing, the quick turnover clothing that was using slave labor, and they got it absolutely in the neck, and their share price went down. So yes, I think that this information is pretty important at the moment. And will continue until there are solutions, but the solutions have to be part of an ecosystem in order to make sure that companies as well as communities are positively impacted.
Tony, one more quick question. Government sanctioned forced labor is much in the news at the moment, especially after the communique from the G7 the weekend. Are there any particular challenges that presents in relation to data, accessibility?
Maybe. I know probably, Murray, you're looking for a really good answer for me. And all I can say is maybe, I mean, with legislation and regulation and political willpower, to me, it's always a maybe, and we'll see, and give it some time. And if you get the right wind behind those sails, then absolutely. If not, maybe.
Maybe, I think, is good enough, Tony. That's fine. Thank you very much indeed. We're now going to move to our question and answer session. So we've got some questions coming in through the Q&A, and I've got some questions which for each of you, in fact. So I'm going to go first to Elena. We've got a question from Caroline Sloan. Please, could you say a little more about the FAST initiative, Elena?
Sure. So yeah, the FAST initiative is basically was set up by the government of Liechtenstein, and it was basically a coalition of financial institutions with modern slavery survivors as well, looking at the role of finance in fighting modern slavery. That was that work lasted for a year, and at the end of it, they developed a blueprint with 5 clear goals on how investors and the finance sector, so not just investors, but the whole financial sector, could look and understand modern slavery and what they could do to basically assess the risks, but also use their leverage, provide remedy for survivors. And then also how they can get together to develop creative solutions. So yeah, and the initiative is still run, and they actually provide a lot of services for and training sessions and many other help materials and guides and tools for investors and the whole financial sector on how to use it. And most of it is free to use and free to access. So I would suggest that, yeah, it's basically fastinitiative.com, I think, and then I will post the link on the comments so you can have it. But it is a good tool for it's fastinitiative.org. Sorry, it's a great tool for the financial sector in terms of understanding how to work on modern slavery.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Elena. I've now got a question for Anita from Hope Show, and it's a question on engagement and remedy. And the question is this: a key element of the UNGPs is remedy. How can we encourage investors to use the data to which they have access to engage with companies so that companies can improve their performance on managing modern slavery risk and change abusive practices? Anita.
No, well, thanks for that. I mean, remedy is a key part of addressing a human rights risk. Just stopping and seizing a particular business action that results in human rights harms is the first part of it. The second part of it is looking at the victims and people who have suffered as a result of that, and to ensure remedy is taken into account. How that can happen is a couple of ways. I mean, we do ask companies to provide access to remedy through availability of grievance mechanisms. And in the case of modern slavery, that would be to workers throughout their supply chains to be able to connect with them and to address those issues. But more, it is really for the company who is in that position where they have identified this issue, have taken steps to address it, then need to include in that plan how they're going to remedy that situation. So for example, in a situation of forced labor where migrant laborers, for example, are often forced to pay recruitment fees to labor organizations or to companies in order to gain employment with them. And often enough, this then ends up being a situation where they are in debt bondage and have to continue to work for the company in order to pay off that loan. And that loan was taken up just to get recruited and to have that job. So that whole concept of removing, one idea is, once you cease that practice though, what about those workers who have had to pay for those loans, who have had to, they need to be reimbursed for that monies. And so really setting up funds and putting aside funds and reimbursing those workers is part of that process of providing remedy. And companies can do that on their own. They can do that with their suppliers. In addition, there is legislation to also address some of these issues, but really companies have that direct relationship with those victims and need to take those steps into account. Does that answer that question?
I think it does for me. We'll have to go back to the questioner to see if they're happy with that answer. They may come back in the Q&A if not, Anita.
Right.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. I've got another question, which could be for any of the panelists. And I should also say, of course, we've still got Dame Sarah Thornton here and Florian. So please do feel free to come in response to any of these questions, as well as our panelists. A question from B. Delgado. There's huge opportunity for investors to use their leverage to push for meaningful disclosure. But how do we incentivize companies in the lower tiers to get on board and to contribute towards collecting the data which is so desperately needed? I'll leave that open.
Since I'm off the mic, I'll just jump in here, right? So, I mean, if you look at supply chains as well, usually the leaders who have taken action have in their supply chain the laggards or the lower tier companies are in their supply chain, and so it is really not just for investors need to use their leverage to speak to companies at the top of the supply chain to say that you need to ensure your practices are cascaded all the way down. And so these companies need to really enforce that through their supply chain. And that's really the way you can get that leverage. Using, the leaders, the big brands, to really push suppliers to say, you're a supplier, I'm going to be reviewing your practices, or these are the practices that I require you to have. Pushing that is one thing, but also companies need to take steps to enable them. And part of that enablement is really having things like responsible purchasing practices, because you can't have it both ways. You can't have it such that you want, scrape the bottom barrel prices, but yet not have these sorts of harms of where workers are being oppressed and you have really very low wages, for example, or you end up using migrant workers because of the low wages and the ability to really control them. So it really is a change in mindset, this whole idea of stakeholder primacy. It's not just about profitability, it's about sustainability of your whole supply chain. And so in addition to companies at the top of that chain, really pushing companies, the lower tier companies, it's also about them making changes to their practices, understanding what those harms are and what changes they need to make so that will enable companies in the lower tier levels to really be able to put in place good, responsible business and employment practices.
Anita, I just have a comment about that, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, but there's really, I think the consumers actually need to be part of this. Huge companies, Unilever, yeah, they can only do so much, but sometimes they only take 3% of a company's business, and that's not actually enough to actually move the dial. So don't you, with this new upcoming of these apps where you can figure out from farm to the jeans that you're wearing, do you see those as actually being more of a bigger impetus for there to be a fundamental change at the start of these supply chains?
I think everybody has a role to play, and consumers are a big factor in them. If consumers say, I'm not going to buy from you because these are your practices, or we want a particular sustainability practice throughout, then that definitely is going to be a driver. So, it's not just this concept of really all stakeholders need to use their relevant leverage collectively to ensure we have a more sustainable sort of economy going forward as part of that. So I agree definitely that customers are part of that process.
Because I think when it comes to investors, investments managers don't do anything that their investors or the people that put money into them want. So if there's this new generation thinking, actually my money can contribute to transformational change, great. But investors don't put their heads above the parapet. They do what the people that invest in them do. So, I mean, that's one of the bigger challenges, I think. They're in a weird position. They invest the money, but their money's not there. So they have to do what their mandates tell them to do, right?
Well, as part of that, and I will, really, Elena, I'm sure has a lot to add to this. I mean, that's why we work with the investor community. We work with asset owners, we work with asset managers, and, going towards the context of, it's not just about the bottom line, it's about a duty to respect human rights. It's about looking at the broader issues. So once you bring that into play and understand that it's not shareholder primacy, it's not just business primacy, it's stakeholder primacy, and everybody needs to take that stance. It just can't be, well, the financial markets work in this particular way, and so somebody else has to give. Everybody needs to take a role there.
Yeah, and I would add as well that at least for the PRI, I mean, when we work with certain investors that are called universal owners, like these issues are key, because basically, I mean, these are issues that impact a whole economy, and therefore, I mean, there is no way to diversify the risk. Yeah. I mean, you're gonna lose no matter what. So definitely something to think about, and also it's extending the mandate of investors as well, because it's not just about the financial return, but also, yeah, what kind of world we're building for the people that you're going to pay pensions back to. I mean, you're going to give them back money, but then it's going to cost them more to access water, clean air, and other services. So then their money's not going to worth the same. I mean, even though you're making the money at the time that they collect their pension, it's not going to worth the same. So it's definitely things, it is part of the mandate, but I agree, like also consumers have a role to play. I think we're too used to this model of getting everything for very cheap, and that creates a perverse incentive for companies to then just think about how can they cut cost and put pressure on suppliers as well, and create these environments where suppliers then are put it under pressure, and then creates the conditions for increasing the risk for modern slavery, for overworking, overtime, low wages. So I think there needs to be a change in how we calculate labor costs and how that is included. And I think we should go a little bit further and say, well, maybe it's not labor cost, and labor shouldn't be put on the cost side of the equation, but it should be an investment, and it should be an asset. And then once you move it to the asset side of the equation, then you think about it very differently. Yeah, so definitely something, I mean, definitely there's something fundamental in terms of how we think about these issues. So I agree.
Elena, thank you very much. Can I just bring in the Commissioner, please, Dame Sarah?
Thank you very much indeed, Murray. And I was just going to draw together some of the comments. We've just been talking about supply chains. I completely agree about their complexity and the lack of visibility beyond the first tier, and also then the traceability. And I'm sure all of you have spent time talking to businesses, and the issue about certain foodstuffs, for example, in terms of traceability is highly, highly problematic. And they know that there are problems in their supply chains, but of course they're in level 4, 5, 6. But it does seem to me that if we want action on supply chains, this point about investor leverage is absolutely crucial, because we want to create as many incentives for businesses to do this, and investors asking the right due diligence questions, I think, is key to that. And I can't resist the temptation. You mentioned the communique from G7, Murray, earlier on. Paragraph 29, if you haven't seen it, it's not massive, but at least it's there. And we did some work with colleagues in Canada and the US ahead of G7 to say, please don't just focus on the most egregious cases of state-sponsored forced labor in China. This is an issue across the world and in G7 countries. It's not something that just happens elsewhere. And so really pleased to see there is that commitment in paragraph 29, and that request for the trade ministers to work on that leading up to, I think their meeting is in October this year. And my understanding, I've just heard today, I think it's the US that's leading on that. So then they're pretty forward leading, certainly the Biden administration about this. So that's good news. And it just seems to me that that sort of thing can really influence both businesses and investors, because they'll be watching which way the political wind is blowing. And if they see that commitment, I think they will be thinking about, okay, how much more do we need to do on a voluntary basis before we have more and more regulation? And just an example of how, well, in fact, how regulation can really change behaviours. You'll be aware of the import bans that the US use, their Customs and Border Protection, withhold release orders. And of course, they've been used more in the last year than they have in any of the previous years. And talking to the insurance industry, another bit of financial institutions, they were saying that because of those import bans and the risk of them, the insurers are putting different clauses in insurance policy. So they transfer the risk of not doing due diligence to the company. And it's just another way of creating kind of pressure on businesses to do the right thing. But it's that link, I guess we want to make it a virtual circle, don't we, between kind of regulation, business activity, and of course, the vital bit you've just been talking about, consumers. But having been doing this job for a few years now, I do get frustrated because I think I'm absolutely right about consumers, but where do you start asking the right questions? I think it's really very difficult for consumers, unless you're buying, potatoes that were dug out the ground up the road, whether it's coffee or chocolate or technology, it's really difficult because of the traceability in supply chains. So great points, and just thought I would add a little bit to it, Murray.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed, Sarah. Did any of the panelists want to come back on any of that, in particular to Sarah's last question there about where do you start with consumers? Because I think it's a really interesting part of the jigsaw, really, isn't it? How that fits in alongside investors as a lever. Any response from any of the panelists to that question Sarah's posed, one we're grappling with?
Yeah, I guess well, because we work more with investors than consumer, it might be a hard question to answer, but I can give you an example. Yesterday, for example, I was moderating a panel on healthy food systems, and we were talking about food and beverage companies, and then whether and the issues are in between, like undernutrition and obesity. And there was a particular question around an article that was in the FT in terms of Nestlé. I mean, even though they do have commitments, they want to be a wellness company and a healthy company, so they realize that actually 60% of their whole portfolio is not healthy. And some of the products that they have, no matter what they do, are not going to be healthy. So it was a huge wake-up call for them in terms of, well, how do we keep up with our commitments, but at the same time, how do we keep working with the actual products that maybe are quite important for the portfolio, but that are creating other issues within society. So I think, yes, there is some work that we need to do with consumers, but at the same time, like, companies do have the power to edit their options as well, and to understand that they don't need to wait for people to say, well, we don't want products that cause obesity, for them to say, well, this is a societal issue, and we're actually putting a lot of pressure on the health system by creating this issue ourselves, just because it makes us money. And I think, that was a good example of a very transparent position that Nestlé took, instead of coming out and saying, well, we want to be a wellness company, but we just realized that where we are right now, we're not going to get there very soon. And probably this is not coming necessarily from the consumer, but it's coming from other stakeholders that are putting pressure on the company, including investors, to put their money where their mouth is, in the sense that they are saying they want to be a wellness company. So then what does that mean in practice? So I think it's a combination of many things. I think it's the same, like we shouldn't wait for consumers to send a signal, as much as we shouldn't wait for then governments to send a signal. I think everyone has a role to play, and we have to do it all together, and wait for the next person to maybe take a step for us to do the same.
Thanks very much, Elena. Anita.
Yeah, I think those were great points that Elena made, and as well, Deep Sarah Thornton. I wanted to just kind of pivot a little bit on a point that was raised in relation to data and modern slavery. And the fact is that, this idea of accuracy and the availability of data, when it comes to the concept of modern slavery, it is always going to be a situation where it is an illegal activity. So obtaining that data is going to be very difficult. It's not that easy to obtain that data. People in situations of modern slavery are being oppressed. They are being hidden. How do you get that data is going to be very important. So sometimes, technology and the solutions that they provide can provide some amount of accuracy in data, but that can't be where it ends. Companies need to do the work. It's not easy. And investors need to do the work. All the different stakeholders need to do the work and really need to understand their supply chains, take actions to understand their supply chains, and to do the work to verify that kind of information. And looking at a situation of where, we talked about state-sponsored forced labor. Where there is state-sponsored forced labor, there are always going to be issues as well, I guess across the piece, but more so in that situation, the availability of verifiable data. The kind of data you get is usually from interviews with workers, freely provided voluntary information. These workers in the situations of modern slavery are not in a situation of providing voluntary information. So that risk of the quality of the data, how you get that data, how you may need to piece together informations or situations, not based on direct availability of data, but to understand the context is going to be very important in trying to understand the data, understand the risk, and using your leverage to make decisions to drive different types of behaviors. Hope that helps.
Thanks very much, Anita. We're getting quite close to 5:30. I'll see if we can squeeze a couple more questions in because we've still got unasked questions in the Q&A. There's a quite interesting question about where survivor perspectives fit in this context, because this is something which is very important to the Policy and Evidence Centre and many working in the sector. This is the question: awareness of modern slavery always comes up as a priority need to get companies and others to take this issue seriously. But those best able to create awareness are focused on the survivor needs and dealing with the fallout of modern day slavery. They need funding to promote awareness. What do the panel suggest should happen to fund awareness raising, particularly using frontline organisations and survivors themselves? Any thoughts from any of the panel?
Go ahead. One suggestion that I may have, especially where these risks occur in sort of high-risk industries, certain types of industries, certain sectors, certain high-risk countries, where you have companies who are operating in these regions. Companies can come together to collaborate and to provide funding to get this kind of research going, to really support these areas. That can be also part of their remedy in a situation where they have uncovered a particular situation. They are remediating victims, but also as part of that remedy, providing and coming together, not individual companies, but I think the companies as a whole collectively, providing funding or doing their own research, finding experts to do their own research to really understand those issues. So I still feel in that particular situations, businesses can play a key role in providing some of that funding.
Thanks very much, Anita. Florian, did you want to come in?
Yeah, maybe just very briefly on this question. I can't really speak to the funding question, but on the relevance of the role of information from survivors. I think that's definitely a point that we're trying to highlight in the report. I mentioned earlier, we do go significantly beyond sort of the conventional types of data that businesses usually focus on. And we do highlight the role of survivor support organizations, for example, the information that they may be able to provide, the domain knowledge that they may have that other actors don't have. We also highlight a number of innovative uses of technology that may be useful to collect information on the ground, so to speak. And so some of you may be aware there is a growing area of work and literature on the use of worker voice technology, for example. There's also a lot of discussion on the limitations of those technology uses, but there's certainly, I think, a lot of promise for that technology to address some of the problems or shortcomings of traditional audit approaches. So in a nutshell, it's the use of technology, for example, through smartphones, to establish a more direct connection with individuals, be it workers or individuals seeking work, that enables a more direct link to them and a more authentic way of collecting information than relying on intermediaries and auditors and so on and so forth.
Thanks very much indeed, Florian. It's now 5:30, so unless any other panelists wanted to urgently say anything extra, I'll give them the last chance to say anything if they wanted to. No, then I think we can finish on time at 5:30. So it just remains to me to thank all our expert panelists and the Commissioner, Dame Sarah. Thanks very much to the research team for this excellent report. And thank you to all our participants and all your excellent questions. Apologies to those who asked questions which didn't get asked. Some of them were actually answered in the course of other questions being answered. So apologies if you're left with the feeling your question didn't get asked. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but it's been an excellent and really rich discussion. This report, we hope, will be a springboard to further work by the Policy and Evidence Centre on this really important question. And I think we've heard today lots of really interesting ideas about what that future, what those future research projects might begin to look like. So that's been incredibly helpful for our purposes as well. So thank you all very much indeed from me, and we hope we'll see you all again and stay in touch with you all. Thanks very much indeed.